Welcome back to a very special episode of Case of the Sunday Scaries. I'm Elyse, and today we have a very special guest, Alexa Berger Billings, a producer on what seems to be numerous true crime documentaries. I did a little IMDb scoop on you. And today we're talking about the current #1 true crime documentary series on Netflix, American Murder, the Gabby Petito story. Thank you so much for joining me.
Oh my gosh, thank you for having me. It's so great to be on here, meeting you, talking to you.
Well, before we jump into this documentary, I'd love for listeners to get to know a little bit more about you. And obviously, congratulations on the huge success of this docuseries. I think it's pretty much the only thing in my TikTok feed right now is the discussion of it. So congratulations on that.
Thank you. Thanks. It's same on my end, on my TikTok. It's crazy to constantly see it on your FYP when you've lived in it for so long.
How did you get started in the true crime space?
It's weird. It's not something that I ever saw for myself when I was, younger and in college. I majored in TV and film production, and I kind of was working in the space of entertainment, but I started working with someone in the industry, Mike Sparrow, actually, who's one of the directors of this documentary. And I've always been a fan of documentaries. And so when I started working under him, I fell in love with it. And I kind of like to say that it found me, and it kind of, awoke something in me, because I've always wanted to have a job that makes me feel fulfilled. And so I felt like it was the perfect match to be able to tell stories that were either giving people a voice that they haven't been heard or bringing justice to something. So it's been amazing. So grateful to have this job.
And speaking of which, like I said, I did a little IMDb research on you. But for the listeners, can you share, if they've already watched the Gabby Petito documentary, can you share other projects that you've worked on that they can watch?
Yeah, I'd love to. So just to, name a few, I was grateful to be a part of the Murdoch Murders on Netflix, Southern Scandal, seasons 1 and 2. And that was also with Mike Sparrow, Julia Nason, and the Cinemart. And that was a wild ride to be on for about 2.5 years, living in South Carolina and telling that wild story and letting the characters tell what was happening to them down there for so long.
You said you were down in South Carolina, where the Murdoch murders were, right? You were down there for
Yeah.
2 years, and I've watched that series. It was wonderful as well. And I'll be honest, I used it quite a bit in my coverage. So thank you for making it, because that was a lot of information to try to follow. But in cases like that, in the second series, were you there during all of the trials as the news was actually happening?
So our first season aired during the trial. And I think that's why there just became so much conversation on social media, because people were able to watch the series and get a huge amount of info while being able to watch the trial. But then when we realized that we were going to want to cover the trial and explain what was happening afterward, because some information that was on a gag order and couldn't be released was then released during the trial. So that's why we were able to then break down, Alex's day of the murder and everything. So yeah, we were down there, and there was, some stuff going on. Hampton was never the same, I would say, after either our series or the trial came out. I think the first season, it was very quiet, very quaint. And then after that broke, it was definitely a little bit of a different situation, where you kind of saw a film crew at every corner, and it's not a big town. But during the first season, when we were filming that, we were down there when the Labor Day shooting happened. People
Oh,
are familiar
wow.
with the case. That was when Alex staged the shooting with cousin Eddie. So yeah, we were down there like actively doing interviews and developing the story when that happened. And we were like, oh my gosh, this is crazy. So when you're doing a story while it's developing, it's like a whole other beast, because you're constantly having to like stay on top of it and change the edit. But it was an interesting one.
That would have been quite wild, I imagine, to like get that phone call of, okay, this is looking good. We can all go to bed tonight. Oh, just kidding. He just plotted a fake murder suicide. He's shot, but we don't know what. Would be
I know. We joke that he was
insane.
writing it for us. Yeah, it was almost like you really could not make it up if you tried.
That was such a strange case.
And then I recently, before Gabby, I was a part of the American Manhunt O.J. Simpson doc that was also on Netflix. And that was a little different for me, because I, up until then, had been doing stories that were pretty recent. And to be able to work on a story that is so renowned, and it was the 30th anniversary, and meet the players involved in that story from, either the lawyers or the victims was incredible and very, very moving for me. So those, just to name a few.
30 years makes me feel a little bit old because I certainly remember when that case was all over TV, even as a young girl. Do you have a preference in covering cases that maybe some time has lapsed? Like we all know that, for instance, OJ Simpson just passed away recently, and some of the people aren't
Mhm.
around necessarily, not to defend themselves, but maybe to speak out. Do you have a preference of being able to interview the quote unquote players, the people that are involved, or is it a little bit easier to cover things of the past where maybe there's less loud opinions from the voices that are still here with us?
Yeah, it's funny because OJ actually passed away when we were still in production or in edit. I think at that point we decided we weren't going to interview him, but we did have to change our ending when he did pass away. But I think I do prefer to tell stories that are a little bit more present. I think that one is very specific and stands alone. And I'm so grateful to have been a part of that project. But I think, being able to tell stories that are more present day, and there's still rumors, misinformation, not all the facts and details out there. It's so interesting to be able to tell that story and take the time to tell it fully, for the modern day viewers.
Yes, and we will definitely talk a little bit later about all of the rumors that have flown around about this case. But for your team, what was specific about Gabby's case that made it stand out amongst, it seems like right now, every day there's a new news headline. Yesterday, I think it was Casey Anthony joined TikTok, and that's all everybody could talk
Mhm.
about. So, what was it specifically about her case that made you guys want to cover it?
I think with her case, it all happened in 2021, which is not that long ago, but at the same time feels long ago at this point. But I think when, you're looking at documentaries, you're looking at, what story has been told in a thoughtful and a way that they deserve. And with Gabby's family and friends, obviously they were all over the news at the time, some of them on social media, had a ton of media and press all over them. But it was clear that there wasn't actually a project that was done where they felt like they could dedicate a lot of their time, a lot of their energy, and give everything of Gabby's life, for people to take, a year to focus on it. So
Mhm.
I think that was something that drew us to that. And that was something that the family wanted to do as well. I think they were waiting for that right time to tell the story fully.
Well, like you said, they were definitely all over the news, and then I can't
Mhm.
imagine what it's like to grieve in front of the world. All eyes are on you, and everyone's making speculations why this case was ongoing. So I imagine they needed some time just to grieve privately as well before introducing, a docu series and a whole team into
Mhm.
their lives. So that makes total sense. To give people an idea of how you and I got connected, I just happened to make
Mhm.
an Instagram story on the series. And it's not something I do very often, but this one stood out to me. And so I made a post about it, and somehow it got back to you. And then we started connecting. And the reason for me that this was so different, because obviously, having this podcast, I consume a lot of true crime content and videos and documentaries. But what stood out for me, one of many reasons, was that while many of us were really familiar with the Gabby Petito case, it was all over the headlines. But to me, this docuseries didn't feel like it was adding to the sensationalism. We got to know Gabby as a person and not just a victim. And I think that that is so incredibly important, especially in this case where once Gabby was found, all eyes were on Brian and his family. And where was he in the search? And so I just have to ask, was that a big motivating factor as you guys put together this series? Or did it start to evolve that way as you got to know her family and friends?
Yeah, no, I mean, first off, I have to shout out Katie, my friend, who sent me your post. And the reason why it spoke out to me so much is because I felt like you got exactly what we were trying to do. And that's, the best thing you could ever hope for when doing a documentary like this. And know that because that was top of our mind, I think, when we started this documentary, Mike and Julia and myself, we met with the family actually a year ago, almost today, for the first time. And we sat with them for a couple of days. And I think we knew when they gave us her hard drive, when they gave us her phone, when they
Mhm.
gave us all of her journals, all of her raw videos, and everything. We saw how number one, how big of an opportunity they have given us and trusted us with all of this stuff. So that was something all the way through that we said, let's give everything that they gave us justice and let's use it to bring her to life as much as we can because her life was beautiful. She loved life. She was an artist. She was a dreamer. She loved everything, her family, her friends, animals. Like she was amazing. So when we were given all of this, we were like, it would be a disservice to her and her family to not utilize it and do everything we can to focus on her. And of course, Brian is a part of her story. And
Of
so you
course.
have to, tell his side. You have to tell his story as much as we know, obviously. But we wanted to make sure that her light shined through the most. And I'm glad that you saw that.
Definitely. And I think we spoke a little bit on Instagram, but I want to bring it to light some of my personal reactions to watching this docuseries. For those that have not gone through and heard my story throughout this podcast, earlier I've shared how I was in a coercive control relationship. And so for me, while watching this series, especially, it just knocked me, I mean, kind of a gut punch, to be honest. When you started showing the text between Gabby and Brian, I just had this visceral reaction to it because I thought, did they take my phone? Like, I knew those messages. I've seen those messages. I've seen the pleading, like, just calm down. I love you. All of these things that she was doing to de escalate the situation and to try to not get into conflict with him. And it hit me and it was hard to watch, to be honest. It brought me back to a not so great time. But like you said, in a beautiful way where hopefully other people can get a lesson from this. And something that comes up often is people ask, well, why didn't she just leave?
Mhm.
And obviously that is the question we all get asked if you've ever been through this. Like, why didn't you leave at the first warning signs? I would have. And it's like, you don't know what you would do until you're in that situation. And unfortunately, statistics show it's often the most dangerous when you're trying to leave. That certainly was the case for me. Tragically, it was the case for Gabby. But I think that this series did such a good job showcasing how those relationships escalate. Because obviously, very rarely, you're not going to meet a boy or meet a girl, and the very first thing that they do at your first fight is slap you across the face or throw a punch. It's the smaller things, the grooming process and alienation and control. It's all these things that feel so simple to forgive or
Mhm.
excusable. I know I've said it when I was in a relationship with him, like, "Oh, we're just passionate, we're so in love, we fight hard, we make up harder." And we all had these excuses until the excuses no longer worked to excuse their behavior. And it's a roller coaster that, quite frankly, if I'm being honest, sometimes feels quite nice because some of those little excusable hardships are followed by grand gestures and I love yous and these big romantic things to make up for their behavior. And my point in saying all this is I learned to make myself smaller when I was in a relationship with him. And unfortunately, in doing so, the world around me got a lot smaller as well. And I saw that reflected in this series in Gabby's story, especially, like I said, through her messages to Brian as she was trying to de escalate his anger and reassuring him that you saw the dynamics with her and her family, little subtle things, and with her friends switch, where he wanted more time with her. He was getting frustrated when she was working at Taco Bell. Like, who gets frustrated at somebody getting a job? But that's the stuff that I think that people don't often get to see is it starts with the little things. And then you're almost, as the relationship goes on, that person becomes your everything because they've built it to be that way. So you're no longer as connected with your friends or with your family. And watching that and resonating with it so much, I just had to ask, did you or anyone else on the team feel a personal connection to her story like I did? And did that shape the way that you guys told this? Because I think you highlighted it perfectly.
Yeah, no, thank you. I mean, yeah, there were a few of us that I think related to it in different levels and different ways because you don't have to look at this verbatim and mirror and have the same exact situation, but like you said, you see small glimmers of things that remind you of something from your past. And what we hope is that some people watching it, if it's reminding them of something that they're currently in, it can make those warning signs go off even louder in their head. But I think, yes, absolutely. When we, saw again everything that they give us access to, and we could see all of the small red flags, the small signs of manipulation, gaslighting, control, we knew that we had to broadcast it. And as you could tell, like, especially in the first episode, there was a lot of text messages that we were putting up on the screen. And sometimes we were like, is this too much? It's a lot
Mhm.
of reading, but we knew it was so important. And our hope was that people who took the time to watch this documentary would see what we were seeing, like the Taco Bell, like when we showed one of her journal entries talking about, I'm just so lucky that Brian sticks with me and Brian is there with me. I mean, she made herself small for him because all she wanted to do was make him happy and have him love her and not have him be upset with her. We were very specific and forward with that because we hoped that everyone could see even the smallest sign that unfortunately Gabby didn't see herself, but now we can all see that and learn from that in different ways.
And I think, too, to touch on what you just said, I obviously had my own personal parallels to it, but I was thinking about my friends who haven't experienced, thank goodness, something
Hmm.
along the lines of what Gabby went through or what I went through or whatever stage of it. They just don't have anything to relate to. And I'm so thankful for that. But I think, especially at the age I am now, as my friends go on to have children, for those that haven't seen these shifts in dynamics and experienced them firsthand, I think documentaries like this are a really great tool to make it an emotional reaction to what you're watching so that maybe it can even be a catalyst for them as their kids get older and maybe get into some of these dynamics as kind of warning signs of this is what to look out for. So I think that
Hmm.
this could have a really big impact. And you guys did a phenomenal job doing it. But to take it off
Thank you.
me, because I don't want this to be all about me, and I was afraid that I was watching it through the lens of my own experience. And so I wanted to kind of broaden that scope a little bit. And I ended up calling my mom in Alaska. And I had this parallel too with Gabby of being states away from your close friends and family at the time I was going through this relationship. And so I asked my mom, being so far away, what were some warning signs that you saw in my behavior or changes in my behavior? Because they're not maybe going to notice the tiny day in and day out stuff because they're not there to physically witness it or see it themselves. And something that she said that I thought was really interesting, she mentioned how fiercely I would defend him without anybody
Mm.
asking me to. And I saw her kind of doing that in this documentary as well. Like, no, he's great. Everything's fine. Don't worry about it, mom. I covered for him. I made tons of excuses for why we got in an argument. Oh, well, I shouldn't have said this. And I frustrated him. He had a bad day. All these excuses, right? And so I found it really interesting that even from as far away as Alaska, there were still little warning bells that were going off. And so I think my question to you is when you were interviewing Gabby's friends and family for this, did they also mention small warning signs? I know that she was a little bit concerned maybe about his mom and that dynamic. But was there anything else that was mentioned that maybe viewers at home can use as a takeaway?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's exactly what you were talking about. I think both her family and her friends all kind of said that every time that when they felt like there might have been something off or something concerning, she would put them at ease so quickly. And obviously, who do they trust the most? They trust their daughter. You trust your best friend. You always see the best in them. So when she would put them at ease so quickly, it's really easy to say now, everyone looking at this story and just say like, well, how could you just listen to her and how could you say this? No, you trust the people, you trust that people have their own best interests in mind. And I think they believed their daughter, as I think many people would. You believe your friend when they say everything is okay. And now I think, like you said before, for people that haven't even been in the situation themselves and for them to know it, whether it's, a family member or a loved one, it's something that in the future, go with your gut maybe, or ask all the time. I think that's all you can do on the other end is constantly check in and constantly see if maybe one day they'll crack and give a little bit more. It's hard to see when some people sometimes put blame on the family and friends because it is so easy to judge when you're not in the situation yourself. And we are now seeing all of the details, all of the text messages, all of the videos that they didn't see themselves. They were only seeing a fraction of what was actually happening. And they did everything that they could have at the time.
And like you said, hindsight is 2020, right? Her parents didn't have access to her journals and her text messages and all these things before obviously the worst happened. But I also think too, something for people to listen to and take away is what you said. If something doesn't seem right, just keep asking. I'd rather have a friend be annoyed with me
Mhm.
than the alternative. And I think too, as someone who's been through something on a much smaller scale, of course, I wasn't a reliable narrator of my own life at that time because my viewpoint was so dictated by his reaction to me, his response to me, and what at that point I believed was true. I was the problem. So if your friend or your daughter or whoever it might be, regardless of gender, I think it's good that you don't always trust that they even know if it's an okay situation, especially for young people. I don't think if you have a lot of relationship experience, it's hard to know what is forgivable or excusable and what is pathological. You don't have anything
Mhm.
to compare it to. So I think what you said is exactly correct. If just keep pushing. I mean, what's the worst that can happen? They get a little annoyed with you? So be it.
Mhm.
Switching topics a little bit, you touched very briefly on the social media of it all. And as I'm sure you're aware, there is a lot of heated debates about not just this case, but about coverage of true crime cases and how to do it ethically. So, in producing Gabby's story, what impact does that kind of dialogue have on how you present these cases?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really crazy world we're living in now with these cases where you can either call them online trolls, online detectives. I feel like there's different kinds because, especially in this case, I mean, some of the online dialogue was very helpful to the case. I mean, I specifically talk about the Bethunes, Jen and Kyle, who were in our documentary and are absolutely amazing because they had this van life vlog. That is why FBI was able to locate Gabby's van and find, her body soon after that. And because they posted that video and it got so many views in 24 hours, I mean, that is the beauty of this online community. But unfortunately, with the good, you always have the bad. And I think there is this rapport that goes online where people get a little bit too comfortable of being behind the screen and pasting their opinion and people taking it as fact and people running with it. So you have to balance that for sure. And especially with our team when we were doing this documentary, I mean, we had an amazing team of researchers that would diligently look at the TikToks. We had a legal team. We always made sure that we were not going to put any information out there on our project that we did not know was true or didn't think was true. And I think I would just encourage everyone to do the same when they're reading up on all these true crimes. I think it's so easy, and I do it myself when there's a new story out there and everyone's theorizing. But I think we have to remind ourselves that this isn't White Lotus. These stories are, they're real and they're involving real people. And especially everyone that participated in our documentary were loved Gabby and also came from Gabby's family. And so I just think if everyone would just take a second and respect the people that are going through this personally and understand that if you put themselves in their shoes, to not be so quick to do judgments and theories because these are real people that have gone through like the worst times of their life. So if that's just like a little reminder to not believe everything you read or hear and to be a little slower with the repost, I guess.
I think what you're saying is 100% correct, that we can talk about these things that are part of our current news, but doing so in a way that their family might see it and just keep that in the back of your mind when posting this
Yeah,
content.
I think it's easy to get swept up in it. And I just want to say, I mean, I think I can speak for my whole team and other documentary teams that like this is what's keeping documentaries alive, having people be so passionate about these cases and about these stories. So I definitely encourage it. I mean, the conversation is what is bringing a lot of these victims justice. But like you said, it's just like being a little bit more thoughtful about this because this isn't scripted. This is real life.
Absolutely. And speaking of social media, I had a few days to prepare for this interview because I was a little under the weather. And so I took that time to put up a little question box on my Instagram stories. And when I tell you, never have I received so many questions regarding this
Oh,
case.
wow.
So if you don't mind, can we answer some of those questions or at least walk through
Of
them?
Of course, yeah, let me hear them.
I think the biggest takeaway, and I agree with this 100%, people, to put it nicely, had very strong opinions regarding Brian's parents. And they were
Mhm.
confused as to why there wasn't any charges brought against the Laundrie parents and how were they seemingly not showing any care or regard for Gabby's life or Gabby's family. But what I wanted to ask you is two parts. Did you ever reach out to his family to be part of this documentary?
We did. We reached out to them through their lawyer. Yeah, we reached out, said that we were doing a documentary, asked if they wanted to comment, wanted to talk, and through their lawyer, they declined. That was Brian's parents and Brian's sister.
And then to clear something up, because I rewatched the docuseries back and I very well could have missed it. But another thing that came up regarding his parents, especially his mom, was the burn after reading letter, quote unquote. Did you guys know, or was it ever proven if that letter was written before Brian and Gabby left, or was that something that was given after Gabby's disappearance?
No, good question. And there's only so much we can fit in this series, so I'm happy to clear that up. So it was found in Brian's room when the FBI raided the Laundrie's house, but in a deposition that is, public knowledge,
Hmm.
when the Petito Schmidt family and the Laundries had their civil suit, when Roberta was asked about the letter, she said that she wrote and gave it to Brian. I believe in the spring, but it was she said it was before they went on the trip.
Okay, that clears some things up, but it is her word because I looked it up and there was no date on that letter. Man, do I
Mhm.
wish there was. Wish we could
I
find
think
like
we
the
all feel the
postmarked
same.
envelope. That letter can be taken in one way, which is very scary if it was after the disappearance, or as a mom being a little bit much, but showing a lot of love if it was prior to that. So I think that was one thing that kept coming back to me is when was this written? But guess we don't know except she says it was after or before, excuse me.
Yeah. Yeah, that's as much as I think we're ever gonna know, probably.
Fair enough. Another concern that people had was for how the police handled this. Obviously, you show that they got a call from a third party, someone who had no horse in the race, right? He said, "Hey, we just witnessed this guy on the highway or the road pushing a girl, called it in." So he didn't have any reason to inflate the story or change it up. He was just explaining what he saw and he was concerned. So then we saw the police, multiple of them, and how they all approached this. And I understand that Gabby throughout it was saying, or at least implying that she was shoving him, she was the quote unquote aggressor. But what made me want to go through my TV and scream and shake those police officers is regardless of who the aggressor was, let's say it was Gabby, let's just pretend, even though that is not what the person said when they called in. She clearly, just by size and stature, was the more vulnerable person in that situation if they were in a conflict. And so for me, I was so frustrated. Why are they putting this girl in a van overnight and putting Brian in a hotel? That seemed a bit egregious to me. Did you have an opportunity to talk to these police officers at all that responded to the call?
No, we didn't. We reached out to one of them and asked if they would interview, and I don't believe we ever got a response back. But we never got to talk to them. So, when it comes to a documentary, it's tricky for us when we like to try and give every party an
Mhm.
opportunity to speak. And that is why we decided to just play that body cam kind of straight through. Obviously, having Nicole, Gabby's mom, talk about what she experienced when Gabby called her. But that's why we just decided to play it straight through and, see the conversations that they were having. I mean, you could tell that they definitely had a little bit of a internal debate back and forth about what they
Mhm.
wanted to do. And, it's really hard to see Gabby defend Brian in that moment and not, say anything against him and just want to be reunited with him. It's hard to watch. And it was extremely hard for her family to watch that afterwards. But no, I can understand what you're saying. I mean, seeing such a young, so visibly upset girl be then given her van by herself, was definitely an interesting choice. And I seeing afterwards as well, we had text messages that we weren't able to put in the documentary, but after they separated, she ended up texting Brian and she met up with him at his hotel. And so she stayed with him at his hotel that night and didn't end up sleeping in her van, which again, shows that cycle of that mental torment where when things go wrong, you just want to make up and get back together and want everything to be okay so badly.
Well, and to be totally frank, I would not want to sleep in a van even if by myself, even if everything was going perfectly. So I don't blame her a bit for wanting to go and stay in a hotel with him and not stay in a van by herself. I think that even was shocking for me just on a safety issue. And I'm not obviously going to directly quote, but something in the police officers' private conversations when they were talking amongst themselves was the most horrible foreshadowing. I don't remember what officer it was, but they say something along the lines of, in this situation, in the next call, one of them could end up dead. I cannot imagine for Gabby's family how frustrating that must have been to watch a police officer basically spell out what was going to come and yet not take really strong divisive action. But again, hindsight is 2020. I'm not a police officer. I don't know what they were allowed to do, what they weren't allowed to do. From an outside perspective of someone who's never served, it just seemed very strange. The difference in dynamic between Brian being cool, calm, collected, she's very upset. And it points out to me that I think that in situations like this, at the very minimum, we need better training for police officers responding to situations like this. Because they can't tell what happened 20 minutes ago and they can't tell what's going to happen in the future. So I think we have to take that responsibility away from people, but a little bit more education in maybe how to spot what's beyond what people are saying would be helpful. But it just seemed like a situation where they weren't trained to know what was the best in that situation.
Yeah, no, it's a true nightmare situation when you watch the officer say that, because I think especially when people say something like that, usually you're saying it thinking never in a million years do we actually think that's going to happen. So to know that that is exactly what happens 10 days later is just horrific. But Jim Schmidt, Gabby's stepdad, even said himself in our interview that now that body cam footage is actually used across America in training sessions. And so again, it's horrible that it happened. The whole story is such a nightmare in so many different ways. But the one thing we can take about it now that it has happened is to try and utilize every aspect of it to ensure that it doesn't happen again. So I hope that it can be used now in these training classes and see the nuances of both Brian's demeanor and Gabby's.
Do you guys, when you're deciding what cases to cover, do you guys give any interest into watching social media and seeing what cases are really picking up steam? Like we talked about, Gabby's has been and remains all over TikTok and social media. People are talking about it. But when looking into the future for future projects, does that kind of dictate what cases that you guys choose to take on?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, there is so many stories that deserve to be told on a platform like this. And again, I'm just so grateful that I think so many generations now care about documentaries and care about watching it because it just gives us that space to tell it. But yeah, there's a few I'm looking at right now and following, from the past couple of years, especially sometimes when there's like so many theories and misinformation or just not enough facts out there. It really, to me, it's like I crave to tell a story like that, to dig into it and be able to tell the story fully, give justice to the family and to the victims, and tell the story right. Because that's kind of what it's all about for me. So yeah, long story short, yes, there's definitely a few being looked at the moment.
We talked about this a little bit, but just to touch base on it again, what role do you think social media can play in a positive way for future cases?
When you look at what happened with Gabby and when she was missing, which I think is when this case exploded originally, I think the beautiful thing about it, and at that time, I was also just so, entranced with the case and going on Reddit and everything and trying to see her last movements. Seeing the community come together in that way and checking, their Ring doorbells, checking their security cameras, like the Bethunes checking their footage. That to me is the beauty of it, because that is when you're doing it for the good And then, of course, it always teeters over where then, there's a picture that they think might be her or they thought was Brian and it actually wasn't. So then it steers people in the wrong direction. And the FBI touched upon that too. They got over 5,000 tips and probably only like 15 were actually helpful. But at the end of the day, it did move the case along. So I think as long as you're doing it in a way that doesn't distract or cause unnecessary noise in terms of prohibiting the police and the FBI and actually doing their job, I just think that's a beautiful part of the online community. So no, I would encourage people to do that in things that they see, uncovering, truths of future cases or cases happening now, whether it's looking into the suspects and finding information that hasn't been found, anything of that matter. I think it's like a new age that we're coming across with modern technology. So yeah, that answers the question. I think it's the good and the bad, but I really do think it's helpful in a lot of ways.
It certainly is. We saw even with the Kristen Smart case, if that wasn't for that podcast, would we even know the answer to
Yep.
what happened to her that night? That was all done by basically an armchair detective saying, like, this doesn't make sense. This is so obvious. I'm going to cover it.
Mhm.
And then we all knew about that case because that podcast popped off in such a way. So I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
There's armchair detectives that are doing their best to help a case along. And as long as it's done in good faith, I think it's broadening our neighborhood. That's what I like to call it. So instead of
Yeah.
it just being the people around you with cases like this, it could be the entire US is seeing this face that maybe if they're like me, they're not watching the 5 o'clock news at night and seeing that case of the missing person, but they're probably doom scrolling TikTok and they come across that face. So I
Totally.
think it can be a really great tool for advocacy and also, like you said, for tips as long as it's done in good faith. And to kind of compound on that and wrap this up a bit, at the end of the documentary, I believe it was Gabby's father that talked about
Mhm.
the news coverage for this case because there was some backlash and understandably so. But I can imagine as a parent of someone who is missing, you're like, I want her face everywhere. I want it from midnight to the following midnight to be the only thing on TV. And I could really empathize with that being the initial response. But I have to give him a lot of praise for then, as time went on, recognizing there's a big discrepancy between how white women that are missing are covered in the news and the spotlight that they get versus Indigenous women and Black women. And we all know the case of Gabby Petito. We know Natalie Holloway, Kristen Smart. I could draw you not very well, but I could probably draw you a pretty accurate picture of all of their faces just because I saw it so much when their cases were in the news. And like we said, that's a beautiful thing. But also, this is where I think those of us like myself that have a true crime podcast or make true crime content, whether that be video or audio, or just the people that are talking about it, can kind of check themselves as well and say, hey, yes, I'm covering this case because I know it's going to get views and it's in the news right now. But at the same time, maybe I can reflect on the fact that I haven't covered a case of a Black woman that hasn't gotten this much attention or Indigenous woman. It's something that I think growing up in Alaska, especially, and the amount of cases of missing Indigenous women there and murdered women, it has hit me when I started to learn the facts about that. For instance, to give viewers an idea, Indigenous women in this country are being murdered at a rate of 10 times higher than all other ethnicities. But I cannot honestly tell you the names of those girls. And that's really sad to me. It's the third leading cause of death for Indigenous women. So I think that whether you are discussing true crime content online or you have a podcast like myself, we can utilize social media to bring more awareness to those cases so that it isn't just the white missing girl on the news. And maybe
Mm.
you never know who's listening or who's watching. And that could bring a clue or help bring closure to a family. Because like you said, you never know. There's that couple that was just going through their footage and saw Gabby's vehicle. If they hadn't looked through it and shared it, who knows how long it would have taken to find Gabby. So I think if we as content creators can also focus on these cases, we might be able to balance that out a little bit, is my hope anyway.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. I think we all have a responsibility now with having the freedom and power of social media that you saw what happened with Gabby Petito and all those other names you mentioned. So if you see a story, if you see someone trying to get their story out there, know the impact that you can have on it by just reposting it or doing a TikTok about it or tweeting it and spreading the word in that way. I mean, it is so much more powerful than we realize what we could do.
Yeah, and you never know who it could reach. Well, we are going to wrap this up, Alexa. I cannot tell you how much I appreciate you talking to me today. But as a message to the audience, before we wrap this up with a couple personal questions that I like to do before we close out every episode, if you watched the American Murder, the Gabby Petito docuseries, or maybe you related to anything that we talked about in today's discussion, I just want you to know that there is access to help. You can access confidential 24-hour help on your phone or computer by calling 1-800-799-SAFE, which is 1-800-799-7233, or visiting thehotline.org. And I will just give a really great shout out to that website. They do a lot to protect your privacy. So even if you share a home with someone, they'll walk you through how to make it sure that it doesn't show up on your browser history. So really, really great access to help if you need it. And I will have that in the show notes. But to bring it back to Alexa, I like to ask people this anytime I'm gifted the opportunity to interview people. If you could have the answer to any unsolved case, which case would you choose?
The staircase. I don't know if yeah, that was one of my, the reasons why I fell in love with documentaries. But I would just love to know exactly what happened. The owl theory was a really big one for me for a while. And I know it's, been debunked as well as many other theories, but that one I think haunts me to this day of just wanting to know what happened on that staircase. So
that is a very good one. And it also went down the owl theory because I thought I'd be scared of an owl if it came swooping in at my head. Yes, unfortunately, that one was debunked, but it was a radical idea, is for sure. But I went down the rabbit hole with that one as well.
I was bought in. I was like, okay, we're doing this. Owl. Yeah.
I was
that one
Googling when their mating season was.
Me too. Fully. I'm looking at like their claws and the measurements of the wound. I got really dark into it because I just wanted to know so badly what the truth was because I was so conflicted. I went back and forth with him. So yeah, maybe one day.
Well, and even watching that series, I kind of pride myself on being pretty good at reading people. And I couldn't, one minute I thought, he did it. And the next minute I'm going, that poor me?
Same. Yeah.
Whew, I'm with you. That's a very good case. Where can people find you? And are you allowed to share about anything that you have coming down the pipeline?
No, I wish. I'm grateful to be working on another Netflix docuseries right now. All I could say is it's pretty different than what I've done in the past. It's a little bit of a different topic, but nonetheless is amazing. And I'm excited for it to come out. Hopefully, I think later this year, but I can't speak about it just yet. But no, yeah, I mean, my Instagram, I'm not very savvy on social media. So yeah, just my Instagram where I always post about, future projects and my travels and my cats.
Oh, what are your cats' names?
Their names are Bolt and Zeus. They're two black and white cats.
That's a great name. I have a black and white.
You have a cat too, right?
Yep, yes, I have a black and white cat, and he's an interesting one. It keeps me on my toes, that's for sure.
They're the best. I know. They're staring at me now because they just want to cuddle. They're like, Mom, what are you doing?
Why are you talking about owls?
Yeah, get off, Mom.
Well, with that said, again, thank you so much for joining me today. I was so excited to talk to you and get some of the answers that my audience had and also myself had about this case. And so that's it for today's episode of Case of the Sunday Scaries. I will see you back with an all-new episode next Sunday. Be sure to follow us on your preferred streaming platforms and subscribe on YouTube so you don't miss an episode. Thank you, and as always, until then. Welcome back to Case of the Sunday Scaries. I'm Elyse, and first of all, I have missed being on this mic and talking to you all, so I appreciate you joining me today. Before we get started on today's episode and really amazing interview covering the Gabby Petito story, I wanted to touch on something that I've been seeing a lot of feedback about. On Instagram, I put up a Q&A after watching the Gabby Petito documentary on Netflix, and while there were so many great thoughts and questions, there was one theory that just kept coming up. The idea that Brian Laundrie might still be alive. And honestly, I get it. The timeline is weird. His parents' involvement? Suspicious as hell. The way his body was found so quickly after weeks of searching? A bit strange. I had my own questions. So before we get into the interview, I want to break it down and clear up some of the confusion because this episode is about Gabby, her story, and this documentary, and I don't want speculation about Brian to take away from that. So let's go over the facts. For those that might not be familiar with this case, Gabby Petito was a 22-year-old travel vlogger. She set out on a cross-country trip with her fiancé Brian Laundrie in the summer of 2021. And from the outside, it seemed like a dream adventure, but behind the scenes, things were unraveling. The biggest warning flag for how this story would tragically end is the now infamous August 12th police body cam footage from Moab, Utah, where police responded to a call from a passerby reporting a man he had seen shoving a woman. When police responded to the scene, Gabby was visibly upset, and yet she was the one that was made to feel like the problem. On August 17th, Brian left Gabby at a hotel in Salt Lake City, and it seems at this time, Gabby was second-guessing her relationship with Brian. Brian returned August 23rd to Salt Lake City, and on August 27th, there's a video showing him and Gabby leaving a Whole Foods together. This would be the last time Gabby Petito was ever seen alive. In early September, Brian returned home to Florida in their van, alone. The search for Gabby took over the internet, and Brian was named a person of interest. On September 17th, Brian was also reported missing by his parents. They said that Brian told them days earlier that he was going to go to a nature preserve near their family home, but he never came back. Tragically, just 2 days after Brian was reported missing by his parents, on September 19th, Gabby's remains were found in Wyoming, and an autopsy determined that her manner of death was homicide by blunt force injuries to the head and neck and manual strangulation. Weeks passed, and it seemed all anybody could talk about was where was Brian, and also how his parents were so eerily quiet. They didn't talk to the news, but more worrisome, they didn't even talk to Gabby's family. Then in October, Brian's parents joined the search, and they found, very quickly, a backpack belonging to Brian. Next to that backpack was the skeletal remains of Brian Laundrie. He had died from a gunshot wound, and among his belongings was a confession, of sorts, to killing Gabby. He made it seem like it was a mercy killing of some sort, which I do not think any of us believe in the slightest. Most of the time, in a situation like this where the victim and the perpetrator are no longer here with us, well, the case would be open and shut. However, with all the strange things and the ever-changing timelines, it really made people question. And I get it. I get why people had questions. And what do I do when I have questions? Well, I try to find answers. So I'm going to share the answers I found with you guys. Many people wondered how his remains would have been skeletal if it was just a few weeks since he had gone missing when they found his remains. And I have to remind people that his remains were found in Florida. And in October 2021, the area he was found in had an average temperature of 88 degrees. It was an area that had recently flooded, and then you add in all the types of wildlife in that area. Not to be crass, but many of his remains did show a lot of presence of predatory animal activity. So put all those things together, and there really is a lot of compounding factors of why his remains were skeletal. Also, another thing I've been seeing floating around was that it was just a skull that was found at the scene. I pulled the medical examiner report and will read directly from it. Quote, "The main scene contained human remains that included a right and left scapula, a right humerus, a left and right femur, 2 tibias, 2 clavicles, pelvis, 1 right ulna, 1 right radius, a sacrum, multiple skull fragments along with the maxilla and mandible, which is the upper and lower jaw, and approximately 25 vertebrae. The main scene also contained personal effects and a handgun." I think why people clung to this idea that it was just his skull that was found was because it was printed in the media that the remains were identified by dental records. And I just want to remind people, unlike CSI and the power and magic of TV, DNA takes a while to get back. So the first identification did come from dental records. However, the theory that his uncle, who was a dentist, was somehow involved in providing that ID confirmation is just not correct. A forensic dentist named Dr. Nancy Havens was the one who compared the dental remains to dental records of Brian's from when he was 17 years old. Guy didn't go to the dentist very often, I guess. Also, the past dental records used to provide the comparison were supplied from a Dr. Udeshi, I hope I'm pronouncing that correct, in New York. So I'm not really sure how this rumor got started, but his uncle was not involved in any of the dental identification. Brian's remains were also positively identified using DNA. They took a tooth and portions of a leg bone and compared them to buccal swabs of his parents. DNA is over 99% accurate. Brian Laundrie is not alive. Now, do I think there's parts of the timeline that will forever be a mystery? Absolutely. And in today's interview, we're going to discuss some of those things. But I wanted to do my part to put the Brian conspiracies to rest. Now that we've got that cleared up, let's get into the real reason we're here, sharing Gabby's story and also discussing the #1 true crime series on Netflix right now, American Murder: The Gabby Petito Story, and my interview with the producer of that docuseries, Alexa Berger Billings, who I'm honored joined me for this conversation.